Yes, thank you very much for the nice introduction. I'm very happy to have been invited to Grenoble. Unfortunately, I'm going to talk in English. It's better for me, but I think it's also better for you, because that way you don't have to listen to all my mistakes in French, right? What can you expect? First of all, I'm just going to give you an overview of where I'm coming from so that you might know my context. Then I'm going to look at some research approaches in terms of what I call, or we call in intent, online intercultural exchanges, or telecollaborative projects also. And then we're going to look at one case study, because I'm very much interested at the micro level of interaction, at the processes that take place there. And finally, there are some findings and tentative conclusions. Now, I come from a university which focuses solely on teacher education, so with BA and MAs in primary and secondary teacher education in all subjects. As in France and other European countries, our educational policy is the European Framework of Reference for Languages, which has a strong focus on skills, actually. ICC, intercultural communicative competence, is also part of that, but it's not really that strongly expressed in the framework. But in our national standards, the educational standards in Germany, ICC plays a big role. So this is part of what we are doing in terms of teaching competences when we teach teachers. We generally follow a reflective practice in terms of teacher education. Our teachers are supposed to connect their previous knowledge with theoretical knowledge and then new practical knowledge while in teaching practice and integrating this and reflecting on their experience. So this is the general approach. And as I said, I'm very much interested in also this is our basis in terms of teaching TEFL, TEFL, teaching English as a foreign language. At my university, it's task-based language learning or task-supported language learning. I'm going to show you one or two examples from an exchange, which I'm going to talk about in detail also later, to show you first of all the expectations some of the students had when joining this project, when this project started, and also their experiences. So Uno, for example, says that he really would like to learn how to communicate in a project like this and to develop intercultural communicative competences. Now, in terms of his experience at the end of the project, we have a specific task. I work with a specific task, a so-called magnifying glass. And the way this works is the students get a large piece of paper like this one, and on the back they have to write their ideas and thoughts about the project they just went through. So they create a mind map about everything that comes to their mind. After about 10 minutes, they have to decide on one incident, one critical incident that is interesting for them, or shocking, or good, or bad, whatever you like. And then they turn this around, and they have this magnifying glass on the other side, and they have to draw this experience, this critical incident. They are not allowed to write, so language is not allowed in this magnifying glass. And then, as a next step, when everybody's finished, all the glasses are put up on the board, and we sit in a half circle in front of them, and then we start comparing, interpreting, reflecting about these experiences, and the students try to find out what did she or he actually want to say with this critical incident. And my experience is this is a very good way of getting into discussion about anything that concerns the student during the project, and it usually creates a very intense discussion. So here, for example, Uno, who was interested in ICC, he found out that the project was with Poland, so Germany and Poland, that in Poland at Christmas time, for Christmas dinner, there's one place that is set, but which is empty for potential guests to come, which is not a custom that we have in Germany. So that's something new he learned in terms of cultural knowledge, right? Now, these two students here, they are more interested in terms of methodology, so they hope to find out how such a project can be done to be able to do it later in school, so to develop teaching competence in this realm. And Aline is more specific. She also wants to know how her partners think about task design, how to design tasks. That's what she's interested in, what they think about schools. Now, if we see this image here, this is not that obvious, you know. Did the students talk about horses in their exchange, or what was the topic here? And after we discussed this and the student eventually explained, she said, well, this is about who is the first actually in the international teams to start working on the task. Who makes the first move to put out a piece of text, so to speak, a first design for the others to react to. And as we know, that is a very important issue in these projects. Who's going to start with the task, and if there is a change between partners in terms of who starts the task, if there's if there are more tasks than just one or two. My interest really is very much on the pedagogical side of these issues, because I come from this specific background and also from task-based language learning. And I think that we need to look more into pedagogy in terms of these projects to really be able to understand what is happening in these projects and how we can help our students develop these competences, these complex competences that we intend them to develop. Now, obviously, as we all know, there are lots of research challenges involved when we talk about OIEs. We all know that it's a very complex learning environment. Different communication channels, different cultures involved, and students have to deal with new tools, which is often a problem for them, right? This case here, for example, he had to deal with the tool Weebly to create a web page design, which was part of the project. And, well, as you can see, was not very happy about this at some stage, because he didn't find the tutorial right away. Eventually he did, and then it was okay. When we look at these projects, what is important to be able to research whatever is happening on the micro level, as we all know, is the emic perspective. So this is really central. So we need to find out what do our students really think about what is happening in these projects. From the teacher's perspective, this is complex as well, because first of all, we are participants, we are teachers, we teach, and we try to develop the students' competences, and on the other hand, we're also researchers. So this is a complex issue that we have to handle in terms of ethical questions, in terms of research and approach. At the same time, we try to develop the students' teaching competences by model teaching. So this is an important issue. We show them, we try to do it the way we would like them to do it later in class, so that they develop experiential knowledge already on that level before they actually enter the classroom and later. Connected to this in OIEs, the workload of the students is really high. All this communication and designing texts and negotiation and so on. So adding extra workload in terms of research tools, in terms of data collection, is a problem. So this is also something to consider when we do such projects. For example, this student here, she has to meet a deadline and has to create something, and she's really frustrated because there's all this work piling up. And if we then add onto this interviews, questionnaires, what have you, then this is also an issue. So this also has something to do with data collection, which I come back to later. Now, as I said, I'm interested in pedagogy, and with that, obviously, task design, and tasks have been said to be central for a long time already. As you can see here, Fürstenberg already in 1997, Levy and Stockwell said this again in 2006, and this hasn't changed. So tasks are really at the center of designing TC projects. There has been a lot of research already, and I just list a few things here, and there are a number of people here in the audience who have participated in this research and have produced interesting and important work. Tasks in call, there has been quite a bit of research in terms of second language acquisition. Carol Chappell is a very important author here. And in terms of task design, there has been a lot of research already from different perspectives and authors. Task implementation is very interesting, I think, because this really looks at the task in process, so what is actually happening on the ground, the nitty-gritty. so to speak, of teaching and of negotiation. This has been an issue, and task and the affordances and constraints of the medium. Hampel from the Open University has done good work on that. So this is also an issue, and one could add obviously task and ICC because there's been a lot of work on that as well. Now, in terms of research approaches, we've had a number of interesting presentations. I'm especially thinking about the one by Kathy Cohen on Thursday, who showed us really nicely the potential of mixed methods research. This kind of approach that tries to combine the strength of both quantitative and qualitative approaches. So I think this is an approach that is definitely necessary for such complex environments. But I would really like to focus on the qualitative part of the research here, because I think if we develop our own practice in terms of teacher education, we need some kind of action research format. I would like to talk a little bit about exploratory practice, which was developed by Allwright and also Hanks a couple of years ago. And what Allwright says is that for a long time there has been theoretical research which developed research on a high level, very explicit theory. And this then is, or was meant to really help people on the ground, but this doesn't really work that way. If research is that explicit, then it's not really helpful for the one who's in the situation, especially not for teachers, I think. So what Allwright and Hanks say that we need, in terms of teacher research, we need to look at another approach which really looks at the research field from the perspective of the teacher, and which he calls inclusive practitioner research. And he goes a step further because he says it's not just the teacher, it's also the learner. The learner is also trying to understand what is happening in his or her context. So both sides are important, and since learners and also teachers often do not really have the words and the theory to explain what they think about in terms of what is happening in their classroom in terms of theory, so they can't give you like this causal explanation why a misunderstanding happened in a project. But they can still talk about these issues, and if you look at the magnifying glass task, for example, there you can see this really well. Without having all that research, they still talk about the critical incident and explain what happened and what their feelings were, and then through the discussion we get to what Hanks calls a lived understanding of what is happening in our classroom without going to this explicit level of theory, right? So what for Allwright and Hanks, what is very important is what he calls the quality of life for language teachers and learners, which is central for practitioner research. I've mentioned this word a couple of times by now. It's important to first of all understand what is happening in our practice. Whether this is at the school level or whether this is at the seminar level at the university, at least from my perspective. This reminds me a lot of when I'm visiting students in teaching practice and I observe them. After the lesson, I first ask them about their opinion of what transpired in the lesson. Because while teaching, so many things went through their heads and they made decisions based on that, which I can't see, right? Which I don't know. I just see what the person is doing. So I need the explanation from the student to really understand, first of all, why the student did what he or she did. So this issue of understanding, I think, is very central before we start looking at solving problems. Action research, on the other hand, starts usually with posing a question. You know, we have this kind of puzzle or problem and we would like to find out about it. Exploratory practice says, okay, first of all, we try to understand, and then in the process of understanding, we also will solve problems. But first of all, there's this level, and I think there's a difference, and this needs to be thought about. Now, from Allwright and Hanks' perspective, everybody needs to be involved in the process of understanding, meaning the learners as well, and he's very clear about that. This means that in terms of understanding and research approach, there's a rethinking in terms of our conception of that. Also, we need to take learners, and he does this very well in the research that he's done with teachers, especially in Brazil, but also in other places, taking learners seriously as developing practitioners and taking their learning serious in the process. So from his or their, because Hanks is very much involved in that as well, from their perspective, is trying to redress this imbalance to teacher-centeredness by more prioritizing learners' understandings. Now, having said this, when we look at the practical research that is then being done, this is very much connected to pedagogy, because he says good research itself can be good pedagogy. And first of all, for him, it's important to get teaching done well before you get research done well. But this is connected. And it is connected to what they call potentially exploitable pedagogic activities. Exploitable in the sense that they can be used for research and for data collection. And I'll show this in a moment. I would like to focus on one case. As I said, this was a teacher training seminar which I did together with my good colleague Gosia Korek in Poland. We've done several projects by now, and on both sides we have teacher education students, slightly different numbers. Project took place for about a semester in 13 and 14, and our focus was to integrate telecollaboration into foreign language teaching for those students in TFL, obviously to develop their multimodal competence, working with the tools, and then the center was really to do telecollaborative task design. So the focus was on ICC task design, how to develop intercultural tasks. English was lingua franca in this project, and as a basic learning platform we used the freebie Canvas. And in Canvas you have a selection of tools such as an Etherpad with a wiki and a chat and forum and so on, the typical things. So we use these tools and others also for presentation like Glogster and so on. Unfortunately, there was no synchronous communication possible because of institutional constraints, at least not in this project. Now, it was the task structure for the seminar was typical for a teacher education seminar. We had two tasks, the first two tasks that created the typical getting to know tasks. First of all, the personal presentation using different tools, but then also forming the group identity, and we've heard this yesterday also by somebody in a paper, that this is obviously an important issue, and it's very productive in terms of creating group cohesion in a longer project. So students had to develop a group identity reflected by the name and then introduce the philosophy of this group to the others in the forum. Then there were two ICC tasks they had to design, number 3 and number 5. One an open ICC activity, I'll show you an example in a moment, and the other one the Weebly, the web page design. And after each task, the others, everybody, every group, every international group, evaluated one task by another group. So we have a reflective task, and that's why I highlighted this here, because this for me is a strongly reflective task for the students in terms of focusing and reflecting the competences they are in the process of developing. So was this task by the other group a good ICC task or not, and why? These kinds of questions. We did the same thing for the Weebly. And then at the end, we had this reflection in terms of the magnifying glass, which I showed you earlier. So that's the setup of the seminar. And while teaching, what happened was that the quality of task results from task 5 to task 5, from task 3 to task 5 changed. They were becoming worse, which is strange. You know, we would say, okay, they've had the experience now, they have done this already once, so now next time they should be able to do it even better. But this didn't happen. So this is, our expectation was higher than the results actually showed. So this was our problem. Just a few words about research methodology. We looked at a number of things, but I focused on this one aspect here now. Which factors impacted on this task development on the micro level in the group negotiation process. That was central for us to understand this. We used, since this is a qualitative study, at least in this respect, we also had some quantitative aspects, which I come to in a moment. We've had different forms of triangulation here in terms of the data. So we have obviously student data and teacher-researcher data. We have a researcher triangulation because there were 2 teacher researchers involved who looked at the data, and so we could compare and discuss and establish some kind of interrater reliability. And we have a lot of methods triangulation here because we have lots of different kinds of data that we generated through our exploitable pedagogic activities, right? These are all activities that the students did. It was nothing, so to speak, on top. It was just something they did in the class. So the design process, the forum, and so on. And also the reflective tasks, I didn't mention so far the portfolio, because for the German class, there was a portfolio at the end for those students who needed a grade. And I'll say something about that as well, because the portfolio data was especially interesting to look at the process. Data coding, we looked at, we had a deductive approach in terms of looking at, well, how does this task design work? Do the components of ICC actually show in the task design? And for that we used the famous and well-known model by Byram, which has been around for ages now, but which we find is very productive in that sense. So the different aspects of knowledge, skills of relating, interpreting, and so on. And in terms of inductive process, in terms of grounded research, we looked at the data from the different collection tools that I mentioned earlier, and 2 sorts of codes emerged in the analysis. One was very much focused on students' identity formation, so their personal attributes, their cultural background, also very much their gender, which played a role, as usually does in these projects, and professional issues, because they were all going to be teachers, obviously played a big role in their identity formation as well. So this was one set, and then the other set was focusing on task design processes. So the role in workload distribution and the process of collaboration. So these were sort of the 2 sets. We try to, and I'll do this in a moment as well, we try to represent these data by looking at critical learning incidents, which sort of triggered contradictions, for example, in terms of cultural background or personal expectations and so on. So we are looking at these contradictions, and this is sort of the key word to say a few words about activity theory, because this is the theoretical background we use to put the different data together. And I have to be very careful what I say about activity theory, because Françoise Blanc is in the audience, and she will stop me right away. I simplify this a little bit now, because it's a complex theory and I don't want to go into that too much in detail. But basically, as we all know, language learning is set in a socio-cultural context. It is based on human activity in terms of interaction, and this is also the focus of analysis, the human activity, looking at different kinds of contexts or communities of practice. And the language classroom is obviously one of them. There are lots of different ones. And Engström, for example, he looked at work-related communities of practice, but with us it's for a language learning classroom. Now, this interaction or human activity is characterized by the participants' motives. So what do they intend to do? Why do they participate? What is their aim, so to speak? And this, as we all know, can be very different, especially in OIEs, where often, at least my students, I've had this again and again over the years, they go into these projects, not all of them, but some, to find new friends. You know? And this is often a problem when I did projects with America, because the Americans were not interested in making friends, they were interested in doing the task. And we know this from the literature. This has been also said a lot in the literature. So motives can be different, and they are. And my motives might be different from those of the students. This interaction with human activities organized on the basis of tasks, obviously. And as we all know also, and this is why this model is very helpful, I think, this community of practice is influenced by institutional affordances and constraints. So the meso and the macro level are important, and that's how it looks like in terms of graph. We have 3 levels. We have the mediational means, which are necessary to actually do the tasks or the activities, the material artifacts. This can be, and symbolic, this can be the language, symbolic artifacts, but it can also be material in terms of the computer, so all the tools that we use. I'm not going to focus on this level now. I'm going to focus on the second level, because it's here where the microprocess takes place in the classroom, so the classroom level. That's what I'm looking at in terms of microprocesses. So we have the subject or subject collective, meaning this is the group of learners that engage in the project, and we're going to look at one group in a moment, and this is an international team of 2 Polish and 2 German students. So this would be my subject collective. And they are engaged in designing ICC tasks. Now, that is my object as a teacher, right? I want them to design tasks, and this might be the same from the teachers, because they also want to develop teaching competences. They might have the same objective, the main object, but they also might have different ones. And this then also might lead to different outcomes. Now, this is, you can also use other terminology for that. What we're looking at is this, on this level, is the relationship between the task as work plan, so the design of the task, and then what actually transpires in activity, so the task in process. And this is happening in the object here. The third level, which was added later to the model, is central, I think, because it really shows the institutional and societal influences on whatever happens in terms of human activity here in the center. So we have the community, and community here is meant the different educational systems, and they're very different in Poland and Germany in terms of what teachers are supposed to learn in terms of competences. Polish system is much more focused on skill development. ICC does not play such a big role, which were actually things that we found out later, right? We didn't discuss this in the beginning, Gosha and I, because we were first involved in the project, and then trying to understand what happened, we discussed this more in detail. So, whereas with me, at least at my university, as I said, ICC, task-based language learning are central. So there are different communities in terms of educational background. Community is also the professional field the students are later going to go to. So if they go to primary school, this might have it's a different community than going to secondary school. So this might have also an impact. The rules, when we look at the rules, we are talking about rules such as rules of communication, netiquette, pragmatic aspects of communication, but it could also be internal rules of the group. So for example, that the group expects, the members of the group, they expect that there is a quick response to emails, or that the partner actually answers the questions, right? And this is also part of the rule system that is being set up. The last point is the division of labor. A bit of a strange terminology here, because this comes from Marxist theory. But what it says is that there is a vertical hierarchy between those involved, and in this case it would be the teacher on the one hand and the students on the other, so we have a vertical hierarchy in terms of power and status. But they are also horizontal. There's also a horizontal level. If we look at the groups, for example, they try to establish division of labor also in the sense of distributing the workload, for example, but also in terms of establishing their roles in the group, in terms of group identity and the working process. So that's the theory behind it, and I'll give you a couple of examples now. I'm going to look at 2 of the tasks, the 2 ICC tasks, and I'm going to show you first our task instructions. And I've highlighted here where we put already ICC aspects into the task instructions, because this is what we wanted the students to do. So for example, we wanted them to design a task which helps learners to get to know more about the online partner. And in terms of Byron, and I'm referring to Byron here, this is a knowledge aspect, to know more about the culture and the other learner on the other side. Then the task should help the participants exchange information about their culture. And when you exchange information, you have to interpret information. And if you go a step further, you might also be able and relate information, to relate the different cultural concepts in terms of the information that you get, which is a quite demanding skill, I think, one of the most demanding in ICC. And we wanted them to make them explore the cultures of their partner. So explore something means the skills of discovery, find out about the culture of the partner, and all of this is obviously online in terms of interaction, so this skill of interaction is always involved in this as well. We gave them a few further hints, and in terms of task-based approach, the only thing we told them is that we would like clarity of instructions, that they pay attention to that. I stress this because in the second task, our task instructions look different. So here, task-based approach is just represented by clarity of instructions. And obviously, since we talk about multimodal competence, we want them to integrate different tools. Now, the teacher's object was obviously to develop competences in ICC design and the data triangulation. Here we have the task instructions and different exchanges, as well as the reflective tasks in terms of the magnifying glass and the portfolio. They all moved into the analysis of this. Now, the result of this one group was that they designed a task for 9th graders, 15 to 16 years of age. And again, I marked the places where they already focused on ICC in their task design. And what they basically did in this task is that they had the learners exchange information about their places, their home and their neighborhood. So it was very learner-centered in terms of finding out about each other's identities in terms of place. So you will have to take a picture of the place where you live or go to school. So knowledge, right? We learn about the place where the person is. Then they want to ask for his or her opinion, so skills of interpreting are involved here when they get the photo of the partner. They also have to write a short text about the picture of your partner. Describe the differences between the place in the picture and the place where you live. And this is a very interesting task because it makes them change perspective. It makes them first interpret their own place as well as the partner's place and then put this into relation. So this is a good example, I think, of skills of relating if you design such a task for learners. In the last phase here, the last step, they're also supposed to exchange their opinions because they do a presentation about their places by email. So with skills of discovery and interaction again. And finally, they ask the partner if they would like to visit your place and why and what he or she thinks of the place where you live. So there's also this emotional aspect involved in terms of attitudes, aspect of curiosity and being interested in the place of your partner. So one can say we were very happy with this task, actually. When we looked at what transpired in the terms of the microprocess and we looked at the Etherpad, what happened was that in this case the Germans provided the first task design, and then Stefan here, who's the Polish student, one of the Polish students, he added to this, and there was ensued quite an intensive negotiation about what should be in the task, and then eventually they decided on the task. They included a little bit of what Stefan said, but not a lot. They did include the historic buildings that he refers to here. We might also use some historic buildings, but the rest they didn't. And in a way, it was a good thing that they didn't, because that way the task stayed more in terms of the skills of Byron. Because what Stefan comes with is really factual knowledge, and a very specific kind of factual knowledge, sort of a high culture, the big C knowledge that he's very much interested, or what he thinks ICC represents. Whereas the students from the German side who had more competences already in terms of ICC, they were more thinking in terms of the skills. And also in terms of the knowledge, they were thinking more in terms of task-based language learning. What is important for my learners who are 15 years of age? Are historic buildings, is that interesting for them? Architecture? Probably not. They look at the place where they live. And this then came to being through this intense negotiation. Okay, now what we have here, if we look at the activity system again, we can see that in the object I designed the IC task, and we have an impact from the community because of the different educational systems, as you can see, as I just explained. And in terms of the division of labor in this task, it's interesting that they really shared the workload, and there was really intense negotiation, as we could see from the data. Now if we come to the second task, this was a much more complex task in terms of web design, and the same data were the basis here, and they were supposed to create a Weebly website which was built up by different tasks. And what we specified here in terms of the task was very long task instruction, so I'll just show you parts of it. Technology, we wanted to have them focus on technology, so there should be 3 online tools. Also on the different skills, the language skills, traditional skills. Then ICC, but we didn't specify this, we just said ICC because we assumed that having gone through the first time, they now know what we meant, they did a very good job, and now this works fine. So we just said ICC. And then we wanted more more general task criteria. So for example, a purpose for the task sequence, clear task instructions, also balance of task demand and task support, because often students in the first task had forgotten to give some language support for the students, things like that. And then as well as providing choice to the students. So you don't have to read all of this, it's just to show that procedures, we gave them the procedure, and it was very detailed in terms of how they were supposed to go through this task. Now what they did was they developed this Weebly, which is focusing on communication in terms of the world of travel, but what it really does, it's very much focused on the traditional skills. So discovering the world, it says here, which is the ICC focus, but there's not much ICC in this task. What they really did is they created a conversation, a model conversation about booking a room, so skills of speaking. They have to write a text. What is also interesting is that out of 9 steps in this task sequence, in 7, they have to ask the teacher for feedback. So they produce something and then they send it to the teacher, and the teacher gives feedback, and then they can continue with that task. So it's very teacher-centered. Now, the critical incident in this respect was that we had a problem in terms of the division of workload and leadership formation. Now, here, the Polish student Stefan, he made the first suggestion, and he developed almost the whole task in detail already and sent it to the German students, to his partners. And then the German students made certain suggestions which were based on their view of how this task should be. First of all, in terms of ICC, and they wanted them to communicate earlier, because they don't really communicate. What they have to do, they have to design, they have to explain individually why they like a certain place. And then at the very end, they have to decide for one place. Now imagine this, you know, you represent Grenoble and Paris, and at the end you have to decide for one. I mean, this doesn't work, really. Because you are so much in your place and you have to give up your place, you won't. So you need to redesign the task. And that's what Melanie says here, that there should be much more choice. Instead of having them decide on one place, there should be, for example, a traveling guide where students have choice and have a possibility to negotiate and also bring in the different versions of what they think the place should be like. Or come up with the 5 most interesting places or something like that. So what we have here is, we have a very traditional skills approach in terms of the whole Polish system, and a very strong teacher presence, which is also part of that system. And we have an uneven workload distribution. There's hardly any negotiation. Stefan suggests the task, he puts the task design into the Etherpad, then the German students react, but he doesn't take on the changes that they react. And just very few. So that at the end it's basically his task. There's hardly any negotiation of content here, which leads then to this task which is not what we expected. A few words, because I focused on one case now, a few words about cross-case analysis, because we obviously looked at the other cases as well. And what we found is that this case is in a way representative, because what we can say is that intense task negotiation between students led to positive task results in the sense of developing ICC. If negotiation was reduced, then results were poor. And this was mainly because of the workload distribution. Yeah, and I'll come to that in a moment again. Another thing was complexity of tasks. A more complex task, like the weekly, for example, led to less goal clarity, and task complexity led to a horizontal division of labor. So that means that the students, once they had this complex task, they divided labor. You do this, you do that, and this depended on their preferences or on the perceived competences. So Polish students focused on ICC, focused on the skills often, and the German students focused more on the task-based aspect. But if there was no negotiation, then this didn't come together anymore in the end, right? And another thing, as you can see in this example I showed you, Polish students favored a strong teacher control in their task design. So there was really, they really relied on vertical power distribution in the classroom. Teachers very important and decides what's happening. Okay, now our potentially exploitable pedagogic activities in terms of hangs and all rights definition were the tasks themselves, and not just the task I showed you, but also the evaluation of the task through the other groups, because this again was very interesting to see what kind of criteria students use to evaluate the tasks. And then we have the reflective tasks, which I think are very important in terms of generating the data we need, the magnifying glass and the portfolio. The magnifying glass discussion, I showed you a couple of examples. Here we have a problem situation again, as you can see. You know, there's a clash, they misunderstand each other. And what happens is that when the students work in their teams for a long time, they are sort of in their teams. And there's not a lot of exchange. In this discussion at the end, the students show their different critical incidents, and they really get into this good discussion. And those students where the partnership might not have worked that well, which is often the case in telecollaboration, they do see that for others it has worked really well. So they see that even though it has not worked for them, it does work in terms of the design as such. And they find out why it hasn't worked. So in that sense, also on an emotional level, it is important for students. And the portfolio is, now I just show you a few things of the portfolio, because again it was a very complex, and I can say more about this in the discussion maybe later if you're interested. We used an e-portfolio which we developed in intent, so learners while doing this class had a diary where they noted all their thoughts and ideas and so on, and then at the end of the seminar they then took these data they had generated and wrote their portfolio based on this, and we gave them a frame for this. One aspect of this was that in this portfolio for intent, we developed the telecollaborative effective person, the TEP, T-E-P. And we said, okay, there are different domains that this person has to be able, become competent in: intercultural, technical, linguistic, and social. And students then, while going through that, they could tick the aspects they were interested in to develop. To tick those that they already know and have in terms of competences, and those they want to develop in the course of the project. Because it was a semester long, there were several tasks, so they could actually develop their own learning by looking at these competences. And in the portfolio, they reflected about this, and I've done this the first time with TAP, and I must say it was incredibly productive from what I could see. It was a good assessment task, self-assessment task for them. They also had to look at their local teams, what transpired there, so on that level, and they also obviously had to look at the German-Polish teams and reflect their personal experiences, and also learn from our mistakes, meaning our mistakes as teachers that we made in the process. So they also had to reflect on the teacher role, and they also had, for example, to choose their best task and explain why this was their best task in the group. So there were different things that moved into the portfolio in which generated a lot of interesting data for us. Now, couple of conclusions. For the Stephanie, in her portfolio, she says, for the teacher, there's no possibility to directly react on to problems and issues coming up during the teaching of the project. If task instructions are not clear enough, students can misunderstand them. So this is a rather bleak outlook, right? So they realize, obviously, task instructions are important, but the fact is, the question is, what can we do in the process? And I think this is something that we need to think more about. So some findings in this respect. First of all, and this has been also said in the literature, I think making students' expectations about project outcome is important to do this in the introductory tasks, to include it right there, and have also partners compare, not just post it, but compare and react to it, and have a small discussion about this, so that they realize what are my partner's expectations. One thing. Task instructions have to be to the point, as with the first task, so clearly tell them what you want in terms of ICC, and maybe also downsize the task instructions, because I had the feeling that we meant well by giving them a complex task instructions for the weekly, but it was obviously too much. We should have done this maybe in phases, or I don't know, a different way of handling this. So if it's too complex, then it's not helpful. But what is very crucial, I think, is and central to any teaching is the safe learning atmosphere. And this is central also to task-based teaching, because students really have to feel confident enough in our classroom to contact us as teachers for support when tensions arise. And if we don't have the safe learning atmosphere, if they don't feel they can contact us, then we do not learn about things like that. In the discussion you mentioned, Francois, that we can't tell them where to go with that data, right? They choose different channels, Facebook or what have you, and this is okay. I mean, this is what they use in private, so why shouldn't they use this in the project? And we didn't restrict this in any way. But we also didn't become part of their friends group on Facebook, right? That was their space, and what we saw eventually was just what we had on our learning platform, which is a dilemma for the researcher who would like to see all of it. So we have to find other ways to sort of trigger this. And I can say that the students here, they did send emails to us when problems happened in the groups, when partners didn't reply and so on. So I think the safe learning atmosphere is central. And finally, to introduce task-based format discussions to assist students in comparing their educational communities and their rules. So this would be an aspect. And research in other areas has shown that the midpoint of a project is especially critical. And I think at that point, for example, a simple questionnaire of finding out what the situation is, a very simple one. What did you like? Where are the problems? What would you change? You know, things like that. A short one in class, in a class discussion, would be productive in terms of finding out where issues are and how we can deal with that in the process. The diaries and the magnifying glass reflection are crucial to this. So I can only stress portfolio work because it generates good data, not just for us as researcher, but, and this is important for me, it helps our students understand what happened. They reflect about it and they learn in the process and become sort of researchers, reflective researchers themselves. And I think this is what we want from teachers at least. Okay. Almost coffee break. I don't know if there is coffee, but if you look at the magnifying glass here, again, this looks like coffee break, but this is not true. You would think, oh, this one guy is the Polish guy. Here was an earlier project. We had a 4-1 situation here, 4 German learners, 1 Polish student. And you would say, oh, he doesn't care, he just relaxes and they work hard. That was the interpretation by some of the students, but this was actually not the case. The case was that in the first, this was synchronous at that point, referring to synchronous situation. In the first chat, the Polish student was very uptight and frightened of talking to 4 German students at the same time, right? So they really tried to create a safe learning atmosphere for him in their group. And she chose this picture because in the second chat, he was very relaxed. And he enjoyed the chat, as you can see. Thank you very much.